Hey, everyone. Welcome to the QCP. Wait, is that right? Questioning Christianity Podcast. Yeah, QCP. Everybody's got an acronym these days.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
RH over there. I'm DM, and welcome to another podcast. Rob, you doing all right?
The only problem is nobody knows what we're talking about.
I think that's all right. You know, if hopefully you've subscribed on iTunes or Stitcher or the TuneIn app, and so you're hearing this. You got in your car and it automatically started playing, and keep it playing because I think we're going to have a pretty good conversation today about these red letters.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
But before we do that, we have to start this episode like we do every episode with Rob and I reciting the Royal Ambassador's Pledge. Are you ready?
No.
As a Royal Ambassador, I will do my best to become. You don't.
I don't know it. I mean, I did it years ago. You know, there's a whole lot of people that don't know what Royal Ambassadors are.
Yeah, it's like the Southern Baptist Boy Scouts.
Yeah, exactly.
You get patches and little pins and stuff too. So.
Yeah, I remember those were good times.
Yeah, and so I remember that pledge. I'll since you don't remember, I thought we could do it in unison. I just assumed that you would have remembered it. That's
no,
crazy.
I'm sorry, Dan. I didn't mean to disappoint you.
But I do have good memories of being a Royal Ambassador, or here's another abbreviation, RA.
RAs, yeah. I knew that.
RH
I know that
was
one.
an RA. DM was also an RA.
Yep.
Pinewood Derby was a big thing that we did.
Yeah.
And my family is a long tradition of Pinewood Derby excellence.
Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah. And even, well, never mind. I'll stop there on that. So we're going to jump in now to the red letters, and we've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And if you listen to last week's episode, we talked a little bit about murder and what's in our hearts and our outside actions. And so we're kind of jumping ahead a few verses in the Sermon on the Mount to talk a lot about enemy love today. And if you remember from our last episode, I mentioned that the lights started flickering and that my 45-year-old Coca-Cola clock stopped ticking when we were planning this conversation. So
hang around.
It could get crazy here on the internet. So Rob, we're going to pick it up in verse 38.
Yeah.
And is there anything you want to say before we jump into reading it?
Maybe a couple of things.
All right.
One is just to remind you guys, one of the things that we have said is this teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, won't mean much to you if you and I have a deficient concept of who the person Jesus Christ of Nazareth was. In other words, if you have this kind of quaint picture of Jesus that pops into your head when you think about him walking the hills of Galilee and talking to his disciples, and he was a great person, he was a very moral person, but in terms of like having a brilliant mind and having something to say that the whole world needed to hear and understand in order to know how to be fully human, if that's not your understanding, then the Sermon on the Mount is just not going to mean much to you. So one of the things that we've encouraged you to do is when you think about Jesus, think about a brilliance on the level of Einstein or more, actually much more.
So this is not just a hippie walking around in sandals flashing peace signs at people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
The cuddly, hippie, loving Jesus is a nice image.
Yeah.
So what's the difference, though, if we think about him in these terms, is if we think about him as a brilliant movement creator and leader, how does that affect the way we hear the verses we're about to read?
Well, they carry more weight. They become authoritative. When Jesus gets to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, as we said, and he says, those who hear these words of mine and pattern their lives according to those words are wise. They're wise people. Mm-hmm. So part of the invitation of Christianity for 2,000 years is to think of Jesus in those terms, not just someone who can somehow beam you up to heaven someday, but someone who actually knows how you're supposed to live now and experience the best possible life. What it looks like to bear the image of God in this world and to be fully human in this world in ways that make you truly blessed to be a part of humanity.
We talked a little bit about legalism in previous episodes, and so some of these hard sayings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, we could almost turn those into some type of legalistic, here's another thing I have to do.
Yeah.
But the case, it sounds like you're saying, is that the reason Jesus is telling us this is not to like keep us in line necessarily or give us just a set of rules to follow, but he wants us to be able to live the best possible life.
Yes.
Have you found that, like, personally? I mean, what about following these red letters leads you to the conclusion that you're living the best possible life?
Yeah, I think that Jesus is going for the transformation of the human heart. He's not trying to get you to modify your behavior. He wants you to be transformed as a human being so that what is happening internally does manifest itself externally. But it's not about the externals as much as it is about the internal transformation. Those externals do make a difference in the quality of your life from day to day. So we're going to jump into enemy love in just a minute. I'll give you an example of that. You've got a person in the office who you consider your enemy, or at work or wherever you work. Mm-hmm. And so the temptation, of course, is to treat that person badly or to try to get them fired or whatever. But what if you had the capacity, as a follower of Jesus, what if you had the capacity to genuinely reach out in love, not fake it, but genuinely reach out in love and be kind to that person, be gentle with that person, and honestly try to seek the best possible welfare of that person who maybe thinks of themselves as your enemy. So long term, what kind of impact then does that have on you, the quality of your experience at work? Mm-hmm. I would argue that it's a difference between you coming home every day fuming to you coming home with a genuine sense of peace. No matter how that person has treated you that day, you come home and you can actually live in shalom and wholeness and well-being because you have been able to love that person. So I would say, Dan, that the people who are able to experience this transformation in Christ and then consequently have their behavior changed are the most healthy people in the world.
You feel like you're part of that group?
Sometimes. Yeah. I think that I don't want to be like the TV or radio preachers who paint this kind of picture. Once you become a Christian, then everything is hunky-dory. And in fact, actually, Jesus taught the opposite, that being a follower of his is, you take up a cross to do that and you step into suffering. But you do become a different person internally, and it's a journey over time. You're growing and you're developing and you're becoming a fully developed human being.
So is that best possible life then? Is that shalom? Is that peace?
Yeah, I think so. That's one way to describe it.
I think
for Jewish people, the word shalom embraced more than just our English word peace. It was not just a lack of conflict, but it was a sense of wholeness and well-being.
Okay. So the challenge of these red letters from the Sermon on the Mount and some of these hard sayings, and we're going to look at one of the hardest ones today, but the result, I guess, of a life lived this way and a life transformed by these words is a life of shalom, a life of peace.
Yeah.
And that certainly, I think, appeals to a lot of us.
Yeah, sure.
We'd like to have more peace, right?
Yeah.
So we want to take a look at verse 38.
Read them for us.
All right. How far do we want to go?
Well, for now, let's go through verse 42.
Okay. And I'm reading from the Royal Ambassador's translation. I don't know what that even means. It's something about pocket knives or something. I don't know. All right. It says, "You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you."
Okay. So these are like extremely challenging words from Jesus.
Yeah.
I should say that we have already talked about this text one time before, way back in episode 4. So if you want maybe a more detailed analysis of that, you can go back to that episode and listen to it. When Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said," of course, he's referring back to Torah, the Jewish law, technically like the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And when he says, "You have heard it said," he's referring back to something that was written down as legislation for them. In the book of Leviticus, it says, "An eye for an eye, tooth for tooth." What we've said about that is that was actually an attempt to reduce violence in the world. It's called the lex talionis. The Jewish law prescribes that if someone wounds you in some way, you can only wound them to the same extent that they have done that to you. So if they take out your eye, then you can only take out their eye. You can't kill them. It's equal retribution. So Jesus is saying that's the law. But remember, Jesus has already said, "I have come to fulfill the law," or "I've come to complete it. I've come to take it a step further." And so he says, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. The word resist, it doesn't mean that you don't stand against evil. The word resist in this text is the Greek word antasthenai, literally anti, against, sthenai, to stand against. But it was a technical term. It was a military term. It referred to the point in battle when you actually engaged the enemy. Think Braveheart. You come out on the battlefield, and at the moment when you cut the guy's head off, okay, that's antasthenai. That's when you have engaged in battle. That's when you've taken your stand against the enemy. So Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't stand against evil or call evil out. He's saying not to engage in violence, to do that. So he goes on to say, there's a couple other examples here. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. As we said in episode 4, Jesus is giving us some ways to stand against evil, but just to do it non-violently. In the ancient world, if a person was to slap you on the right cheek, that meant a backhanded slap, which was a way to insult an inferior. You would slap your slave with the back of your hand.
Yeah, like a backhanded compliment that I might pay you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe that's where that thing comes from.
It comes from the Greek word bakaneus handedus, which literally means I got nothing.
So at any rate, but if you're a slave, you've got a couple options, or if you're an inferior, say you're a Jewish peasant and a Roman soldier slaps you with the back of his hand. Then you've got a couple options. One is you can run or cower, go down on your knees and cover your head in submission or whatever.
And I think that's what a lot of people maybe think when they read that passage. Like that's what it sounds like he's saying.
Yeah, a lot of people think that Jesus
take a whooping.
Yeah, Jesus is teaching us how to be a wimp. And that's what he meant when he said, "Blessed are the meek." Blessed are the wimps. But that's not at all what Jesus is saying. He says, turn the other cheek. And when you turn the other cheek, then you haven't cowered, nor have you reacted in violence. So one option is to run or to cower. The other option is to fight and to try to return evil for evil, violence for violence, which would be a devastating end for a slave or for a peasant. Jesus said there's a third way. Turn the other cheek. Now, when you turn the other cheek, if that person is going to hit you again, then he's going to have to hit you with his open hand, which means that he is treating you as an equal. And it elevates you to a place in your enemy's eyes to an equal. And somehow it transforms the situation. It changes that interaction between two human beings. And then he goes on to give a couple other examples. If somebody wants your outer garment, give them your inner garment. This radical generosity. If a Roman soldier forces you to walk a mile, they could do that legally. You volunteer to walk 2 miles, that's going to blow their mind. Mm-hmm. These ways of being subversive in the world without being violent in the world. Now, does this work? Think about Gandhi, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and the impact that nonviolent resistance has had on our world through that movement. Now, I would argue that nonviolent resistance has actually proven to be much more impactful, much more redemptive in our world than reacting in violence. And so this idea of, if a person slams you, then if you're a real man, if you're a real woman, then you come back and you slam them twice as hard. That elevates you. That shows that you've got self-esteem.
Yeah. But unfortunately, we know what happens after you've slammed them twice as hard. They come back and slam you 4 times as hard.
Exactly. and then you've got to one-up them one more time. There's no place for it to end well. The only time that it ends is when nobody else is left standing on the battlefield. Even then, there's some other enemy's going to come along, and you have to do it all over again. So I would argue that if you really have a good self-concept, if you really think well of yourself, then be the kind of person who can take the third way that Jesus describes for us, to stand against evil, but to do it non-violently.
And to take that third way would be living that best possible life and experiencing
having
shalom.
a life of shalom. Let me give you a less violent example of that. And probably you may be driving down the road listening to this podcast and thinking, well, I haven't hit anybody since I was in the 3rd grade. Okay, think about, are you married, or do you have someone, a roommate or whatever? Then think about the way that you interact with that person. If you argue and you've got to win the argument, when was the last time that ended well for you?
Yeah.
You may actually win the argument. You may actually prove that your mate is wrong about something. But what have you done to further the relationship when that happens? Now, certainly you can disagree and you can, give your opinion, but when the argument becomes a form of violence, I'm going to make him feel stupid. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make her feel insignificant. When that tape's playing somewhere in the back of your mind, maybe in your subconscious, and you don't even know it, then you've reverted to a violent way of doing life. And in the end, you will not have shalom, I promise you.
Yeah. All right. So let's take a look at verse 43.
Yeah.
All right. You have heard it was said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, well, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's a
good stuff.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Jesus, you've heard it said, love your neighbor. There again, this goes back to the Jewish law. It was a part of their law for them to love their neighbor as they love themselves. But a part of that was the permission and sometimes even the instruction to hate their enemies. But Jesus, here again, Jesus said, I'm going to take you a little further down the road. I'm giving you an upgrade at this point. But I tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, and listen closely to the reason that Jesus gives behind this instruction. He says, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now, what he's saying here is not, if you love your enemy, then you're going to get to become a child of God and go to heaven someday. Mm. No, in the ancient Jewish world, when somebody said, you are a child of John, that means when I look at you, I see your Father in you. When Jesus said, so that you may be children of your Father, he's saying, so that you may be like your Father.
Okay.
In other words, he's saying, this is the way your Father functions in the world. I want you to function in that way. And then he gives an example of that. He says, your Father, he makes his sun to rise on the good and the bad, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. He treats everybody well. See? And so he's reestablishing God not as a warrior God who loves his own and hates his enemies. and destroys his enemies. He's reframing their understanding of God so that they know that God is a God who has the capacity to love all of humanity. Which, by the way, if a good Jewish person had read the book of Jonah, they'd already know that, because that's what Jonah is all about. That God is teaching Jonah. I don't just love the Jews. I love the worst people in the world, which was the Ninevites.
They are hard to get along with.
They are. The Ninevites, the one that I work with every day. No, I'm just kidding.
It's like a lesson that didn't sink in.
Exactly. I mean, think of humanity on this long journey and the Bible as a record of that journey. And all through this journey, God has continually tried to take us to the next level. He keeps trying to reveal himself to us. He does that in the book, like I said, with the book of Jonah. Ultimately, he's revealing himself to us through Jesus. But the whole thing is to bring the human enterprise to a redemptive conclusion or redemptive outcome. But the journey's hard, and you take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back sometimes. One day you're able to love somebody who treats you badly, and the next day, you cuss them out or whatever. And so you have to go back and you have to start again. And God, I believe, understands that. By the way, this happens on a global sphere as well. How many times do nations have to go to war before we find out that war doesn't solve our problems? When will the leaders of the nations learn that Jesus, teaches us the right way? To me, that's a big unanswered question right now. It's something that I honestly grieve over.
It might be the same logic, just on a much larger scale. I don't know. I'm trying to think of like the Office example, and then also like a global nation versus nation example.
Yeah.
But the idea is I could act this way, but the other guys won't. Mm-hmm. And if I turn the cheek, and I'm thinking as I'm saying this, if I, as like nation X, turn the other cheek, then the other guys are they're gonna slap us again, and they're gonna blow me off the map.
Yeah.
Like if we could all do it at the same time, you've seen those old movies where like, all right, everybody's got guns drawn on each other. Like we're gonna put them down on 3.
Yeah.
And they count to 3, nobody's put them down.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I don't know how practically you do that, but if you were serious about peace, you would have to explore that option.
Yeah. And practicality is one of the most well-worn arguments against the way of Jesus. Yeah. It's just not practical. Nobody's going to put their guns down on the count of 3. And by the way, it is why the pacifist movements down through the years have been ridiculed so much. Anabaptist, for instance, that's still a vigorous movement in the Christian community.
What was that?
Anabaptist.
I don't know what that is.
It was a group of people. They were a part of the Reformation. I'm not as familiar with the movement as others, but I know that they were a pacifist movement.
Okay.
And they simply would not resort to violence. And they were persecuted severely, and by some other people who claim to be a part of the Jesus movement as well. Mm-hmm. There are really practical, hard situations. How am I going to avoid violence in this particular situation? Somebody breaks into my home. Well, I'm going to defend my wife and my children if I possibly can. But maybe those individual scenarios that we can dream up, maybe they don't get us off the hook for thinking about those situations where we're actually much more proactively violent. It's one thing, I think, to try to get a gun out of a person's hand who's breaking into your home or whatever, and doing something violent to another human being, whether it's physical or verbal or whatever. Jesus goes on in this text. We didn't quite get to the end of it, where he says, I want you to be perfect as my Father, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well,
I noticed that part.
Yeah. And a lot of people will read that. A lot of people have read the whole Sermon on the Mount, and certainly this part, and said, Jesus never intended for us to follow this, because
it's like hyperbole or something.
Exactly. It's like, I've heard this argument all my life. What Jesus is actually doing is trying to show you how you can never measure up, so that you have to accept the grace of God. you see. Maybe one day in heaven we'll live this way. Well, Dan and I have beaten this drum over and over again. Jesus came proclaiming the kingdom of God in the here and now, teaching his followers to live this way now, not legalistically, but as a part of a transformed life to live this way. So, by the way, he's not saying, I want you to be sinless like God is sinless. The word perfect here is the Greek word telos. Another place he uses it is in John 13. John says that Jesus loved his followers to the end. The word end is telos. It means completeness, or sometimes it's translated maturity. I want you to follow the pattern of your Father in heaven to its end. Mm-hmm. Be complete. Be whole people. That's what he's saying. And so, can we do this? I would argue that the Christian movement in this world depends on us starting to show the world that we actually have something different to offer as followers of Jesus, and nonviolence is a part of that. I would also argue that our world, the survival of our world, depends on it. And, I tend to get a little bit preachy and animated when I start trying to encourage people to take Jesus seriously.
We talked last time on our episode about spiritual formation that this is a development, and then some of these characteristics, these outward characteristics, will start to express themselves naturally as our insides, I guess, are changed. And so maybe as we try to embrace some of these hard teachings of Jesus, we will become naturally less violent people. Yeah. And so while we're trying to think of like these specific scenarios, well, if Iran does this, and if my coworker does this and that, maybe we can't come up with a clear, all right, here's what to do in that situation. But over time, as we develop, we become naturally less violent, naturally more prone to love our enemies. But even as I'm saying that, am I trying to take the sting out of these words of Jesus? Am I trying to make them say something softer than what he's trying to say? I don't know.
No, I think that you have to do a both and with that. I think, Dan, I think you have to let the words be as impactful as the words are. And at the same time, know that it is a matter of slow transformation. It is a journey, and we're not going to get there overnight. Which I think it actually encourages us to stay in the journey and not give up on it. Mm-hmm. If I have to get there overnight, well, then I'm not going to be able to do that, so I'm just going to give up.
I'll just be perfect like your father.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I used to read that.
Yeah.
Well, I can't do it. I give up. Throw your hands up.
Exactly. And so give the Spirit some room to keep this spiritual formation thing going. And just know that you're working on yourself as a part of a larger movement. And this movement is eventually going to end with, according to the writer of Revelation, this movement's going to end with all nations coming together around the tree of life. And there's going to be healing for all nations. Please understand that when Jesus came and he revealed himself to the world as the world's Messiah, this is how he's going to get it done. Please reject the readings of Scripture that teach you that Jesus is going to be just like any other warrior god, and what he did on the cross is not quite sufficient enough, and so someday he's going to have to come back and slaughter all of his enemies. That's a poor reading of the book of Revelation primarily. Jesus said when he was on his way to the cross, he told his disciples, he said, I could call 12 legions of angels to step in and to act violently. And by the way, a legion, a Roman legion, that's a military term. So Jesus is being militant in his language. He's being military. I think a legion was like 5,000 Roman soldiers. He said, I could call 12 legions of angels who would step in and violently overthrow Rome, and I could be the next king on the throne. But then he would have just been like any other violent warrior god king. No, Jesus is going to get it done, and he's going to get it done this way, by allowing his enemies to take his life, by not retaliating against those who offend him. Now, Jesus will judge the world. I know that. We confess that in the Apostles' Creed. I think judgment means something different than what we kind of think about when we see this judging God jerking people up and throwing them into the lake of fire. Judgment means making everything right. when Jesus brings judgment to the world, he makes the world right. If you're a person who absolutely will not fit into the pattern of the rightness that the world is becoming, then you exclude yourself from that. And that is judgment. And that's hellish. I mean, the gates of the new city, by the way, if we're going back to the book of Revelation, those gates are always open. Day and night, they're always open. Anybody can come in at any time. Those who don't come into the new city where the nations are being healed are the people who refuse to be healed in that way. So please take this stuff seriously. I think we need some prophetic Christians. In all honesty, it discourages me when I hear Christians cheering for the slaughter of the enemies of the United States. With all due respect, you can't take Jesus seriously and do that. We need to be prophetic. And by prophetic, I mean we need to say this is right and this is wrong. And we can't say that wrong is right.
Y'all may remember years ago now when the second Iraq war started. We were actually living in a military town then, and so we were very much connected with what was happening. I was pastoring a church that was made up mainly of military personnel. By the way, the best people on the face of the planet. Cindy and I were watching the news, 2020 or 60 Minutes or one of those. When the war first broke out, and you may remember that when that the first few days of that, our kingdom of the world, the United States, was launching jets off of aircraft carriers and sending them over into Baghdad. And we were watching this news show, and, they always try to get a personal angle. And so they were interviewing one of the military personnel, the Navy guy, on the aircraft carrier. And his job was to actually load the bombs onto the jets that were taking off. And then one of the things that he did when he was loading the bombs is he would write like personal messages on the bombs for Saddam Hussein. And Cindy and I realized this young man was in the church that we grew up in. I remembered him as a little kid. I remember him being a shepherd in the Christmas plays. I remember him at VBS. Good kid, good young man. And I watched the interview. I thought, what's wrong with this picture? Even if your understanding of the kingdom of God makes room for just war, and if we disagree on that, we can disagree, and I'm okay with that. But if you're a follower of Jesus, even if you feel like you can engage in violence, you got to be able to do it and at the same time love your enemy. Does that make sense? This is hard stuff, right? It gets complicated, doesn't it? Because we're citizens of this kingdom and we're citizens of these kingdoms. I served military personnel for 10 years, and they're the greatest guys in the world. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you have to love your enemies. Probably nobody here has ever written hate mail on a bomb, but maybe you've written something on Facebook. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have to love your enemies. You turn the other cheek. This is the challenge that comes to us as followers of Jesus.
I heard on the radio today, Dan, there's been a survey done somehow. Sometimes I wonder how accurate these things are, but 48% of Americans believe that some form of torture is sometimes necessary and right. 49% believe that it's not. And in that 48% of people who believe that it's right and necessary to torture another human being, there should not be a single follower of Jesus. There just shouldn't be. Not if we're going to read the words of Jesus and take them seriously. And by the way, for the first 3 centuries of the Christian movement was nonviolent. They took the words of Jesus seriously, and they would not do violence against their enemies. It wasn't until Constantine made Christianity the state religion and started baptizing Roman soldiers that the church embraced violence. Even if you believe in Augustine's just war theory, and you believe that there's sometimes that war is the least violent of all options, still yet, look at the wars we engage in now. And they don't live up to Augustine's just war theory. They're for-profit wars. Most of them are. This doesn't get much news coverage, but for instance, it was right after Trump came into office, he sold Saudi Arabia about $147 billion worth of weapons, which they used in the civil war in Yemen. And as a result of that, the numbers now are like 10,000 civilians have been killed. Christians need to be prophetic and say, no, that's not the way that Jesus taught us to do life. I believe we should love our country, sure. But let me make this clear. If you're a follower of Jesus, your primary allegiance is to the kingdom of God, not the kingdom of the United States. And to be a part of that kingdom, you have to live into the words of Jesus. All right, I've got to quit preaching. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, I was
sermon's done.
I'm fine with it. If there was an easy answer to some of these problems, we would have already implemented it. I couldn't help but think about like the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. What could we do other than intervene, with violence to prevent that? I don't know. Yeah. I would also say that this is not a partisan kind of problem. I think it's a systematic problem that we've got.
Sure.
Greed and blood money and all of that stuff. So
one of the reasons we never hear about the weapons deal to Saudi Arabia is because it's not a partisan thing. That Democrats and Republicans are not arguing about putting $146 billion in American pockets and American coffers.
Well, the economy is important.
Yeah, sure. It's the economy, stupid. And here again, I'm not trying to be controversial, and I know that this is complicated. Yeah. I don't know that I'm a pacifist in the sense that I would say that there's never a time to try to intervene in a situation in some kind of proactive kind of way. I think that we're smart enough now that we would actually put the resources that we put into building our weapons, if we would direct those resources in some other ways. If we would build things instead of blow things up, I think we would be much farther down the road most of the time with some of these situations. I don't want the conversation necessarily to digress into political policy. I just want to encourage those of you who really want to embrace this kingdom life to pray seriously about these things, and don't just read the words of Jesus and say, well, that's a nice thought. Mm-hmm. Read the words of Jesus as if he is the only person in the universe who can tell us how to live.
Well, I think we'll end it right there. That's plenty to think about for at least a week until we get another episode together. We'd love to hear what you have to say and love to hear your questions and follow-up comments. Check us out on our website, questioningchristianitypodcast.com, or on Facebook, facebook.com/questioningchristianity. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll try to include your questions and comments in our next episode. What are we going to look at next time?
Adultery.
All right.
We're going to have a fun one next time.
It's getting heavy.
Adultery and divorce, yeah.
On the QCP.
Yeah.
So
you have a little, you had a little swagger with the way you said that. Yeah, that was pretty good.
I don't know. Yeah, we'll see if it sticks.
Yeah,
if you've listened up to this point, so if you're still hearing my voice, that's some kind of good sign, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
That you should subscribe.
It shows that you have a long commute.
That's yeah, maybe so. It's right. Or your phone has like fallen, under the seat. You can't reach it. Yeah. So, but if you are listening, for this long during the podcast, maybe you need to share this with someone else.
Yeah, please do.
And make sure you subscribe. And you can do that through all of the podcasting services. TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and iTunes. But do us a favor and help us out. And maybe it's just as simple as a post on your Twitter profile or Facebook says, hey, check out this podcast, or email it to a friend, or just mention it at the water cooler at work, and we'd appreciate you helping us spread the word. All right, that's it. Time to hit the stop button. I'm Dan, he's Rob, and we'll see you next time on Questioning Christianity.